And here to introduce her process is Ben Halville, her thesis advisor.
This work is vital. Sahara's work is vital, and her own vitality, activism, and organizing show up as essential arteries that flow through the body of her work. It is alive in the present moment, clear-eyed and honest about all forms of terror and violence, and deeply committed to a praxis that cares for all wounds, not only the popular or culturally sanctioned ones. She has created a work that dives deeply into the history of power and wisdom of the Southwest Asian and North African experience in a way that honors, respects, and seeks guidance from Afrocentric Islamic feminist frameworks to describe their deep contributions to the psychological well-being of all peoples. This work is psychological, personal, and political, as it should be. At a moment when violence is fetishized and fantasies of revenge and destruction are not integrated, but marginalized, and they're fetishized and objectified by celebrated by so-called world leaders, it is an act of psychological care to articulate with depth and clarity the essential and often marginalized stories of trauma and humanity of the SWANA community and the expansive diaspora. Sahara scholarship invites a world where clinicians, communities, and collectives can do better. She writes, as a SWANA American woman within a predominantly white Western therapeutic industry, this paper has added the voices and histories of not only several significant and colonially targeted Black and Muslim female freedom fighters, but also the voice of one more SWANA-identified depth psychological student into the world of academic literature. This research will serve me and potentially, and I would add certainly, other clinicians working with relevant populations and holding culturally informed and aligned therapeutic principles with those whose demographics, identities, ancestries, and belief systems align with Black power, Islamic feminist, abolitionist movements.
Okay. For this thesis presentation, I asked ChatGPT, can you please turn the important themes of this 50-page research paper into a speech I can read for a 12-minute long verbal presentation? Because we got our degrees, I'm done with school. I know we all are. So, I'll be reading Chat's presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Seher Ahmad, and today I'll be sharing the heart and soul of my thesis titled Intersectionality of Faith and Resistance, Jihad of the Soul and Liberation of the Ummah. This project has been a deeply personal and spiritual journey, an act of remembrance, resistance, and healing. I wrote this research in the midst of my work as a counseling psychology student here at Pacifica with you all, as a substitute teacher in Oakland, and as a Bay Area born and raised woman of Pakistani and Turkish descent, trying to make sense of a world fractured by war, patriarchy, colonialism, and spiritual forgetting. At the core, this thesis explores the psychological and spiritual impacts of historical and ongoing traumas faced by people of African, SWANA, and Muslim descent. It also uplifts culturally rooted frameworks of healing, drawing from Afrocentric, Islamic, and feminist traditions. In this research, the term SWANA is used as an identity acronym for Southwest Asian North African cultures, where the Muslim majority of the world originates and resides. The identity term MENA, standing for Middle Eastern North African, is used interchangeably with SWANA in this presentation. However, there are conscious attempts to move away from the term Middle Eastern collectively, as it is a Western colonially oriented reference point. So, what brought me to this work? My guiding purpose was to uplift the lives and lineages that have often been misrepresented, erased, or pathologized in dominant Western frameworks, particularly in the field of psychotherapy. My aim was to deconstruct the colonial narratives that have misrepresented the dignity of bodies of cultures relevant to this project and instead amplify their ancestral resilience and moral clarity. According to the City of Oakland's 2018 report on equity indicators, Oakland rated relatively low with substantial room for improvement at a 33.5 out of 100 in their overall citywide equity score. Areas that received the lowest possible score of 1 out of 100, indicating the most extreme levels of inequity, were related to education, public health, including childhood health, physical and mental health, and substance abuse emergencies, housing displacement, and public safety. Since October 7, 2023, the Global Social Justice Spotlight has largely been broadcasting the most recent iteration of the ongoing mass genocidal murder, displacement, settler colonial occupation, and systemic starvation in the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Muslims native to Gaza by the Israeli military, funded and backed by the U.S. government. Since April 15, 2023, citizens of Sudan, approximately 91% of whom identify as Muslim, have been facing the world's largest hunger crisis and one of the worst internal displacement crises, with over 14 million people being displaced from their homes. And chat took this out, but we put it back in. And the citations are in the thesis. The findings of this thesis sought to address the following disparities and ethical concerns within the scope of current research. Americans of MENA descent in the United States have been historically understudied. As a result, enormous gaps in knowledge about health and mental health disparities exist, with broad public health significance. SWANA MENA Arab Muslim identification remains insufficiently represented and understood in Western culture and academia, leading to disparities in research. SWANA Americans have historically faced discriminatory violence, racism, and Islamophobia. For example, after 9/11, MENA Americans endured significant increases in discrimination and hate-based violence, ranging from threats to murders, and anti-Arab hate crimes surged by 219% from 2014 to 2015. The experience of being a group under target through surveillance, hate crimes, post-9/11 backlash, and a hostile national climate has significant negative repercussions for MENA Americans, including pervasive anxiety, alienation, fears about personal safety, feelings of vulnerability, social isolation, and a sense of victimization. In addition to disparities in mental health, compared to the non-Arab white majority, MENA Americans have been found to have poorer general health status and higher rates of hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, respiratory disorders, digestive disorders, and some cancers, explained as outcomes of both direct and indirect historical traumas and discrimination. The prevalence of present-day global humanitarian crises, Western military-inflicted violence in SWANA regions, and health research disparities rationalize the need for further academic exploration on providing care for SWANA American communities in the field of psychotherapy. The primary research methodology I utilized in this thesis project was a heuristic method, which encourages relationship and connectedness rather than detachment through the research process. In this method, the researcher is personally called to the topic and the research is rooted in lived experience. The literature review of my thesis begins by acknowledging and tracing the colonial spread of Islam from its formation in 6th century Arabia to Africa and America, examining how a religion of moral justice has been at times misused by patriarchal and imperialist interests. It acknowledges the trauma inflicted by both Western colonialism and internal Islamic supremacies, particularly on African peoples during the trans-Saharan and transatlantic slave trades, both of which were a significant factor in the introduction of Islam into Africa and America. The trans-Saharan slave trade, which is often overlooked and under-discussed, continued in some form or another for 13 centuries from the early 7th century until the 1960s, where in the Saharan region alone, more than 9 million African captives were deported and 2 million died on the road. My thesis goes on to uplift what has survived these brutalities, stories of resistance and cultural liberation. I studied the writings of indigenous Hausa Muslim women from Nigeria who used literature as a form of self-expression amidst colonial oppression. Through their writings, Hausa women have challenged patriarchal, male-led cultural and relational norms by amplifying language that invites righteous, loving, non-hierarchical ways of relating. Hausa Muslim women speak close to the heart and allow readers to identify shared experiences and observances within their culture, despite their writings being censored by their own Kano state government and misrepresented to be solely regarded as love stories. Oh, I got 5 minutes. I got more. Okay. Hausa lecturer, author, and researcher Uma Aliyu Musa asserts that writers born, emigrated, and displaced within America must adapt to a society confronted with xenophobic attacks, feelings of inequality, the effects of colonialism, drudgery, the history of slavery, migration, rape, and family-related problems. American women's writing reflects hyphenated identities through passionate, self-expressive blends of cultural and neo-colonial identities. I also explored Afro-Islamic movements in America, including the Nation of Islam and the Black Panther Party, from an Afrocentric feminist framework, which upholds its philosophical roots in the ideas that African people must be examined from the standpoint of their agency and centrality of their experiences, and the realities of African women and men should be centered in the narrative of African people via a cultural-specific gendered lens that ensures their voices are featured equally. Okay, I'm gonna skip for time's sake. I go on to explore the abolitionist frameworks of distinguished Black Marxist feminist, philosopher, educator, and formerly incarcerated political activist Angela Davis, who writes about the intersectionality of Black American and Palestinian liberation against Western carceral and militant forces. Angela Davis's work reminded me that abolition is not just about dismantling prisons, it's about imagining a world beyond normalized violence. Whether we're deconstructing the war on crime against Black Americans or the war on terror against Muslims, these campaigns share a logic of domination rooted in fear of resistance. My thesis examines how these wars intersect and how women such as Assata Shakur were criminalized for embodying their liberation. These women and those who love them have carried the burden and brilliance of revolution. Their anger, their art, their sacrifices live on through their writings and in our spirits. I explored the controversial topic of Muslim women being drawn to quote-unquote jihadi resistance movements, not to condone violence or unsafe self-destructive acts, but to understand the psychological and spiritual hunger that drives some towards such extremes. This draw arising from a sense of isolation and marginalization by the West, a quest for identity and community, a desire to be part of a movement bigger than oneself, and feeling that the Muslim population is under threat. What I take from this is the need for spaces of soul-centered healing and moral leadership that do not require martyrdom or self-sacrifice to connect to our ancestral roots and cultural divinity. In present-day neo-fascist ruled America, it is a struggle for many to imagine a world without carceral punishment as the first response to harm or criminality. However, I have seen incredibly inspirational organizing efforts across the Oakland Bay Area communities for these imagined possibilities to be actualized. I also continue to witness and experience deeply harmful cycles of trauma being inflicted upon one another within systemically marginalized communities, and a dire need for communal systems of accountability that replace and oppose carceral capitalist punishment while ensuring public safety, moral goodness, and harm reduction. How much time I got? 2? Ooh. Okay. In this chapter, I explore some principles of Islamic psychology formed by the research of psychologists Abdallah Rothman and Adrian Coyle, and from the first ever co-gendered English translated text of the Quran. In Islamic psychology, the soul is understood to be made up of 4 parts. The fitra, our original, pure, natural disposition as life forms, our true nature. Our nafs, which can be comparable to the ego in Western psychology and is understood as the lower self that becomes inhabited by the corruption of the world. In the Quran, the idea of sin or evil is said not to be inherited, but instead acquired by humans after birth. Islamic principles emphasize that every human is responsible for each of their rightful and wrongful doings, and therefore are an agentic being with the power and free will to choose righteous action. The third part of the soul in Islamic psychology is called the qalb, the heart and locus of our higher self, which holds our ability to choose to turn towards or away from a morally virtuous part of ourselves. And lastly, the fourth part of the soul is called the Ruh, which is considered to be the divine messenger in this pure natural part of our soul. It is the golden light buried in the shadows of the soul that is encouraged in the Islamic world to allow itself to shine. In Islamic psychology, I'm the last one, we got time, right? In Islamic psychology, there's a process called jihad an-nafs, which is the inner striving to confront the ego and the ways we've internalized the world's corruptions, or these nafs, which has pulled us away from our divine, pure nature, our fitra. It is a sacred act of accountability, a process of looking inward with honesty and courage to recognize how harm lives not just around us, but within us. It is a constructive response to the discovery of faults, a necessary confrontation that allows us to begin deep healing work. Contrary to Western depictions and labeling of jihad as an act of violent terrorism or holy war, in Islamic principles, the word jihad in its true meaning refers to the conscious choice to use one's power to detest that which is intensely immoral among evil spirits in relationship to one another and within ourselves. From this effort, we move towards a process called tazkiyat an-nafs, a purification of and reconnection to our soul as a result of committing to this deep inner work. It's a process of returning to the truth within us, allowing our soul's divine imprint to shine through. Like Carl Jung's individuation process, tazkiyat an-nafs is a process of looking clearly at that which does not serve personal and collective goodness, discovering and cleansing the hidden treasures buried in the dirt of our psyche's shadow, and allowing the brightness of our divine nature to radiate in the reflection of each mirror that meets our gaze. In a world that often demands our disconnection, these concepts offer a map back to the self and potential moral and spiritual structures for healing, not only for Muslims, but for anyone seeking to connect to their true self and moral responsibility. As I close, I honor this sacred inner struggle to connect with the soul, alone and together, and to become more aligned with truth and justice, even when it is hard, and especially when it is hard. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahar. Oh, we did it. 17 presentations today. Big round of applause for everybody who's presented. Such a wonderful range of presentations and topics and ideas. So we have about 10 minutes for a break, and then we'll come back at 4 o'clock.